You think you built this company, Michael? You were just a lucky errand boy who married into the right family. Eric's voice cracked across the conference room like a whip, loud enough for the entire board to hear. The kind of laugh-laced insult designed to stick in the walls and in people's minds. And the moment he said it, every head turned to me, from the junior analysts seated along the far wall to Marla from HR, who had stopped taking notes mid-sentence, pen hovering like she was afraid the ink would spill, and the air went thick with the tension of 100 unspoken thoughts. The kind of moment where you can feel your heartbeat in your ears and the cool sting of betrayal like ice water poured down your back. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. My name is Michael Hayes. I'm 38 years old, and I was born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska, where people still wave at strangers from their cars, and you can drive the same stretch of Dodge Street for 20 minutes without hitting a traffic light. But I've been living in Chicago for the last 15 years, grinding through the concrete jungle to turn a $6,000 loan from my mother into a multi-million-dollar logistics firm that now employed over 70 people and serviced 3 states. And somehow, despite all that, despite every sacrifice, the man now standing across from me, the same man who used to call me brother, when we were both working 70-hour weeks, had just called me an errand boy in front of everyone whose opinion could make or break me. Eric wasn't just a partner. He was my wife's older brother, the one who'd introduced me to the world of high-stakes distribution contracts, the one I'd trusted enough to bring into my business after the second expansion when I needed someone I thought wouldn't stab me in the back over a fraction of a percent in profits. And now here he was, making sure every board member saw me as small, insignificant, replaceable. I didn't speak right away. That's the thing about moments like this. If you open your mouth too soon, you let them dictate the rhythm. And I wanted to set my own. So I let the silence stretch just long enough for Eric to start looking uncomfortable, for him to wonder if I was going to crack or if I had something bigger in my pocket than a rebuttal. And the truth was, I did have something he didn't know about yet, but the time to reveal it wasn't now. That was my secret advantage. The thing I'd been holding in reserve for almost 2 years, tucked away like the last ace in a high-stakes poker game, and I could feel the weight of it even as I sat there, letting my mind drift back to the day I first realized Eric might not be on my side. It had been 3 winters ago, the kind of biting January where the Chicago wind will strip the skin from your face if you walk more than 2 blocks without a scarf, and I'd come home late from the warehouse to find Eric in my kitchen, leaning against the counter with a glass of my single malt in his hand, laughing with Claire like they were the only 2 people in the world. And maybe at the time it was nothing, just family, but the way he looked at me when I walked in like I'd interrupted a private joke stayed with me. That was the first crack in the wall. Still, I ignored it because loyalty is a muscle you train, and mine was overdeveloped. Back then, I still believed trust, once earned, was a permanent thing. It wasn't until last spring, when a $280,000 transfer went missing from our vendor payments account, that I realized trust could be weaponized. Eric had an explanation, of course, a timing issue, a miscommunication with accounting, and I let it slide because my wife Claire told me to, and when your wife and your business partner are family, you pick your battles. But standing there in that boardroom, with every eye on me and his words still hanging in the air, I realized I'd been picking the wrong battles for years. The board moved on quickly, agenda items, quarterly projections, the sterile language of business, but I wasn't listening. I was cataloging every smirk, every sidelong glance, every moment that would feed into what I decided in that exact moment. I was going to fight back, quietly, patiently. And when I did, it wouldn't just be about winning back control of the company. It would be about making sure Eric, and anyone else who thought I was just an errand boy, would regret underestimating me for the rest of their lives. I glanced down at the Mont Blanc pen on the table in front of me, the one my father had given me when I signed my first big contract, the one he told me to only use when you're writing something that matters. And in that moment, I knew I was going to use it for the last signature Eric would ever see from me. I didn't speak to Eric again until 2 days later, when he called to clear the air in that oily tone he used whenever he wanted me to pretend nothing had happened, and I told him we'd talk after the weekend, which in his mind probably meant I was sulking, licking my wounds, maybe even doubting my own worth, and that was perfect because the more he believed I was off balance, the easier it would be to keep my hands moving behind the curtain, setting up what needed to be set up. What he didn't know was that the first person I called after hanging up with him wasn't a lawyer, or even my wife, but Sam Ortega, my old roommate from UNL who had gone on to become a forensic accountant for one of the biggest white-collar crime units in the Midwest. And when Sam picked up, I could hear the clatter of a coffee cup and the low hum of jazz in the background, and I knew he was in his office, which meant I had his full attention, and I told him, hypothetically, if someone wanted to find a pattern in vendor payment discrepancies over the last 2 fiscal years, what would it take? And Sam, bless him, didn't even ask why I was asking. He just said, it would take a signed release from the account holder, and someone willing to go through 12 months of transactions line by line, and I told him I could get him both by Monday. The trick was not to move too fast. People like Eric have a nose for sudden activity, and if I shifted my habits too sharply, he'd smell it. So I kept my routine exactly the same. Morning runs along the lakefront, coffee at Kinsey's street diner, where Carol the waitress would still slide me an extra slice of sourdough without charging, afternoons buried in contract negotiations or supplier calls, evenings home with Claire, who was growing quieter by the week, as if she knew a storm was coming and wasn't sure if she wanted to be on my side when it hit. That was its own problem, one I didn't know how to solve yet. See, Claire was complicated. When we first met, she'd been this magnetic mix of ambition and warmth. She could talk to a room of strangers like she'd known them her whole life, but she also had the kind of precision mind that could spot a flaw in a business plan before the ink was dry, and for years she'd been my anchor. But lately she'd been spending more evenings out with friends and more mornings avoiding my eyes over coffee, and when I'd ask if she was all right, she'd give me that thin, polite smile people give when they're choosing silence over truth. That smile was starting to feel like a warning sign. I told myself not to get distracted one war at a time, but the truth is, betrayal rarely travels alone. By the second week of my quiet investigation, Eric was tightening his grip on the company in subtle ways, inserting himself into client calls I'd always handled alone, offering cost-cutting suggestions to the board that just happened to cut into divisions I'd built personally, even suggesting we take the company in a new direction that, if implemented, would make my role almost ceremonial. And the board was eating it up, not all of them, though. There was one, Janet Willis, our coup, who'd been watching me more closely than the rest. Janet was one of those rare executives who didn't just operate in the corporate world. She thrived in it without losing her humanity, and I'd hired her 5 years ago after seeing her dismantle a room of competitors with nothing but a spreadsheet and a calm voice. She caught me in the hallway one afternoon and said quietly, "They think you're folding." I told her maybe I was just tired. She gave me a look that said she didn't buy it and added, "Good, let them think that." In that moment, I realized Janet was the genuine ally I didn't know I had, but if she was watching, that meant others were too, and not all of them would be friendly. Case in point, 2 days later, I got a call from a man named Rick Fallon, a supposed friend of the family who claimed he'd heard about the unrest in the company and wanted to help me secure my position. And in exchange, he'd just need me to sign over a minority share temporarily to give him voting leverage. The moment he said, "temporarily," I knew he was one of Eric's fishing lines, sent to see how desperate I was. I played along just enough to keep him thinking I might bite, then told him I'd need to think on it, which earned me a chuckle and the kind of drawn-out "sure" that says he already thinks he's won. I hung up knowing I just met my fake ally, and the worst part was, he was probably going to keep sniffing around. Meanwhile, Sam had found something. He didn't say what over the phone, just that he'd meet to see me in person, and it's bigger than you think. We met that Friday at a little bar on Clark Street that hadn't changed since the 70s, and when Sam slid a manila envelope across the table, I could feel the thickness of the paper, printouts, dozens of them. And he told me there were not just missing funds, but ghost vendors, accounts set up in the company's name with no real product or service attached, all siphoning money in regular, almost imperceptible intervals. And here's the thing. Every single one of them had an address that traced back to a property owned by Eric. I didn't let my face show what I felt. Not there, not with the bartender close enough to overhear, but inside, something cold and certain clicked into place. This was my proof. Not enough to take to the police yet. The pattern needed more time, more rope, but enough to start tightening that rope around Eric's neck without him realizing it. I thanked Sam, bought him a drink, and walked out into the January night with the wind biting at my ears, thinking about the Mont Blanc pen in my desk drawer and the moment I'd get to use it. For a brief second, I felt something like hope, a small win, a foothold, But it didn't last because when I got home that night, Claire wasn't there. Her car was gone, her phone went straight to voicemail, and when she finally came in around midnight, she smelled faintly of the cologne Eric wore. She didn't say where she'd been. I didn't ask yet. For the next 3 weeks, I lived in two parallel worlds. The one everyone could see, where I moved through the office with a slightly slouched posture and a tight smile, letting Eric and his growing circle believe they were grinding me down, and the other, hidden world, where every night between 11 and 2 in the morning I sat at my kitchen table with Sam's files spread out like a battlefield map, highlighting patterns, connecting timelines, matching transactions with client visits and shipment dates until the lines and numbers stopped looking like accounting entries and started looking like a confession written in code. And the deeper I went, the more obvious it became that Eric wasn't just bleeding the company for cash. He was building something else, something designed to run parallel to our own operation, and I had no doubt that once it was fully up and running, he'd find a way to shove me out completely and present the board with a new vision that didn't include me. The deadline came in the form of a board retreat scheduled for April 3rd at a resort outside Milwaukee, the kind of place where decisions get made over golf and expensive whiskey, and I knew in my gut that Eric planned to use it as the stage for my quiet execution. That gave me exactly 6 weeks to build my counterstrike, and every day that passed without tipping my hand was both a victory and a test of patience, because there were moments like when Rick accidentally stopped by my office to suggest we talk about succession planning that I wanted to slam the door shut and tell them exactly how this would end. Instead, I added another layer to my plan. I called Janet into my office one late afternoon under the pretense of reviewing staffing budgets, then slid a single page across to her, a vendor list with 5 names circled in red, and told her quietly, "Don't say anything now. Just look into these addresses." She didn't ask why. She just nodded, folded the paper in half, and walked out like nothing unusual had happened. That was the thing about Janet. She didn't need the whole story to know which side she was on. Around that same time, Claire's distance hardened into something more deliberate. We were two strangers occupying the same house, our conversation stripped down to logistics. "Did you pay the power bill?" "Your mother called. I'm working late." And while I didn't have proof yet, the longer this went on, the more I was sure her loyalties had shifted to her brother. I started noticing small things. A password-protected folder on her laptop that hadn't been there before. Phone calls she took on the back porch in the cold rather than in the warmth of the living room. The way she locked the front door behind her even if she was just running to the store for milk. It didn't escape me that the symbolic object, my father's Montblanc pen, had gone missing from my desk for 2 days and then reappeared exactly where it had been, as if someone had borrowed it and wanted me to believe I was mistaken. That pen had been with me through every major signature of my life, and its temporary absence felt like a message. "We can take anything from you." Rather than react, I added it to the ledger in my mind, another debt that would have to be repaid. By mid-March, Janet had quietly confirmed what I already suspected. Those vendor addresses led to shell companies tied to 2 of Eric's personal holding LLCs, and one of them was currently leasing warehouse space that could easily mirror our own operations. Same equipment, same shipping schedule, as if Eric was building a ghost version of Hayes Logistics to step into the moment he'd finished hollowing mine out. That was when I locked in the final component of my trap. I started shifting certain client contracts, the ones I knew Eric had been eyeing, into a separate entity I'd incorporated under a different name years ago, back when I was still scrappy enough to think about worst-case scenarios. That entity, Midwest Freight Solutions, was technically dormant, but fully legal, with a clean set of books and no connection on paper to Hayes Logistics. Over the next 2 weeks, I funneled just enough work into it to make it look like a side hustle. Nothing threatening, but with clauses in place that would trigger exclusivity agreements the moment certain conditions were met. I didn't tell Janet about this part, not because I didn't trust her, but because the fewer people who knew, the less chance of a leak. By the time April 3rd rolled around, Eric had no idea that the clients he thought would follow him into his new empire were already tied to me in a way that couldn't be undone without breaching contracts and facing lawsuits that would bleed him dry. Still, I needed one more piece before I sprung the trap, something that would make the board not only see what he'd done, but feel it in a way they couldn't ignore. And that's where the Montblanc pen came back into play. On the morning of the retreat, I slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket, a quiet reminder to myself that this was more than business now. This was personal, and when the moment came, I would make sure Eric signed the last document of his career with it. The board retreat was held at a sprawling lodge in the Wisconsin woods, the kind of place with high ceilings, stone fireplaces, and the smell of cedar and expensive cigars hanging in the air. And as I drove up that winding private road, past the thawing fields and the stubborn patches of snow clinging to the shadows, I felt that still, razor-sharp calm settle over me. The one I used to get in my early days when walking into a pitch with everything on the line. Because I knew that by the time the sun went down, Eric's grip on my company, my name, and my life would be gone. He just didn't know it yet. We started the day with golf, as expected, and I let him win the first 9 holes, feeding his confidence, watching him work the board members like a politician on the campaign trail, slipping in little jabs at my burnout and overcommitment between jokes. All while Claire, yes Claire, stood off to the side in a sleek black coat, phone in hand, watching me with that distant expression she'd been wearing for months. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. By the time we gathered in the lodge's main conference room after lunch, the stage was set. Eric's new vision presentation queued up, his all eyes in the room leaning forward, ready to vote me into irrelevance. And as he clicked through slide after slide about efficiency and modernization, I sat with my hands folded, the Mont Blanc pen heavy in my pocket, waiting for the perfect moment. It came when he unveiled his strategic partnerships, listing the very vendors and warehouse space Sam and Janet had traced back to him. That was my opening. I leaned forward, voice steady, and asked, "Eric, could you clarify for the board the ownership structure of those vendors?" He laughed, tried to wave it off, but I had already signaled to Janet, who handed each board member a neatly bound packet, copies of the forensic accounting report, complete with addresses, shell company documents, and the lease agreements showing Eric's name. The room went still. You could almost hear the weight of realization drop onto the table. Eric sputtered something about temporary arrangements and oversight. But before he could spin it, I pulled the Mont Blanc from my pocket, and slid a single-page document across to him. A resignation agreement, predated and prepared to transfer his shares back to me for $1 in exchange for my discretion in handling the matter internally. His face drained of color. "You think you can blackmail me?" He hissed under his breath. "No," I said. "Just loud enough for the others to hear. I think you can save yourself from a criminal investigation if you sign right now." The board was silent, waiting. Eric looked around the table, saw no allies. Only the cold stares of people realizing they'd almost hitched themselves to a sinking ship. His hand trembled as he took the pen. That was when I leaned in and delivered the first twist. "By the way, those strategic partners you thought you'd take with you? They've been under exclusive contract with my other company for weeks. Even if you walked out with half the board, you'd have nothing to run." He signed. And just like that, the Mont Blanc's ink sealed the end of his career. But the second twist was waiting outside the conference room. Claire was there, and before she could speak, I handed her an envelope. Divorce papers, accompanied by printouts from the same forensic trail, showing her logged into Eric's ghost company accounts from our home Wi-Fi, confirming what I'd suspected. She hadn't just sided with her brother. She'd been actively helping him. "You'll find the settlement terms are generous," I told her, "considering you'll be leaving with exactly what you brought into this marriage." Her eyes flickered with something, anger, maybe fear, but I didn't stick around to read it. I walked past her, down the long cedar hall, and out into the crisp Wisconsin air, the weight in my chest lifting with every step. Justice hadn't been loud or messy. It had been precise, quiet, and final. The Mont Blanc pen sat warm in my hand, the same pen my father had told me to only use when I was writing something that matters. I just used it to write the end of the 2 people who thought they could take everything from me. As I got into my car and started the engine, I didn't feel triumph exactly. More like the deep, unshakable peace of knowing the debts were settled, the ledger was clean, and the road ahead was finally mine again. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.